think 40 years ago, what brought our two countries together was some common interest, common strategic interest in the world then to respond to the Soviet expansion. And our two countries believe that we do share this strategic common interest, and that's what needed by both countries. So I think we started the relationship, even for President Nixon's visit, it was very much driven by the perception of this growing common security interest or strategic interest between our two countries. Of course, the world has changed a lot over the 4 decades, and our two countries have changed a lot. But I think the key to success of the relation over the 4 decades has been identification of the growing common interest. We started with some strategic interests, then it broadened into economic, trade, financial interests. Then we look at all the emerging global challenges. So I believe even today, this growing common interest is still there. And this will continue to serve as the foundation of a stable relation between China and the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, your perspective?
Well, Chris, thank you for inviting.
That moved over time based on the administration and your experience.
I think it did move over time, because very often you have a new administration here, and they have new emphasis, new priorities. But I think, on the whole, we have been successful in building common interests or common approach to many of the challenges in the world or in the region, in Asia-Pacific region. Well, the Korean Peninsula would be a good example. We've had very effective coordination bilaterally and also in the United Nations Security Council. And I think this kind of communication and coordination between our two countries could take some credit from the recent positive development on the Korean Peninsula. Another issue could be, climate change. The previous administration spent a lot of time, a lot of energy on this particular issue. And we did have good cooperation on climate change. I think it's largely because of cooperation between our two countries that the Paris Accord came into being. But of course, you are no longer in it. But the climate is still changing. Whether you recognize it or not, it is still changing. So maybe with the new administration here in Washington, there's a shift from the so-called global commons to each country for itself, maybe. What kind of impact this will have, I cannot tell. We have to watch and see. But I think it's quite clear that there are always issues, problems that will bring our two countries together. Although sometimes we might have different approaches. We might look at these things from a slightly different point of view. But there is always a need for us to work together on these difficult issues.
Mm-hmm. And let me just press you a little bit. Are there particular areas, regardless of administration and its focus, where you think we have not managed to connect with each other? For example, the differences in our governance systems or something along those lines?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's a good continuity on the Korean Peninsula. And we certainly support President Trump's planned meeting with the leader of North Korea. We want to see it successful and productive. And we will do whatever we can to help. And we are also working together on many other issues, like counterterrorism. Of course, we'll see what will happen on the Iranian nuclear issue. But still, I think all the major powers share the interest to handle this issue carefully, constructively, and maybe pragmatically. We are ready to continue our cooperation with the U.S. But there are things we still to make more efforts. For instance, I think that maybe the most important issue is mutual trust. About 3 weeks ago, I was at John King Fairbanks Center in Harvard, and they published a book, China Question. In the book, they introduced the concept of understanding deficit. They said, just as the U.S. has a trade deficit with China, there's an understanding deficit. I quite agree with that. We still have a very big deficit in understanding. As you said, the perceptions of each other. Sometimes it's driven too much by suspicion, by fear. I don't think that's helpful. Of course, nobody can base its foreign policy on love. It might be too naive. But it's certainly very dangerous to base foreign policy on fear, suspicion, or even hatred. I think that this is still a big problem, maybe the most serious problem between us.
Thank you. Ambassador, let me give you a chance to respond.
Yeah. Well, first of all, about this so-called Thucydides trap. I have had a number of very interesting and long conversations with Professor Graham Allison. And according to the professor, of all the 16 cases in past history, 12 of them ended in war and conflict. 4 were cases of a peaceful transition of power. But I believe that for the relations between our two countries, we should certainly not be the 13th case that will end up in war and conflict. But neither should we follow exactly the example of these 4 peaceful transitions. Because first of all, what is at issue is not transfer of the global dominance from one country to another. I don't think that this is the situation in the world today. What we should aim at is working together to build a kind of a community for the world, build a shared future for all the countries, including our two countries. So in this sense, I think we should not follow the old path. Because if you follow the old path, maybe some trap will be inevitable. We should try to open a new trail. I think that's the idea behind our proposal to build a new model of great power relations between our two countries. It has nothing to do with transfer of global dominance from the U.S. to China. It has nothing to do to try to constrain the United States. Of course, we don't want to see more interference in our domestic affairs, of course. But we want to build a community of nations together with everybody else. And we want to become a good partner. I think what we are aiming at, if we put it in a very simple way, is a good partnership between our two countries. When we have common interests, we work together on that. When we have some problem, we try to manage it, try to solve it in a constructive manner. Hopefully we could make further efforts in that direction. Then, right now, trade issues maybe are very prominent. But I think, first, it would be too simplistic to say that trade deficit would mean loss, trade surplus would mean gains. I think the real situation is much more complicated. And you have to look at the whole production chain, the value chain, and international division of labor. But still, too much imbalance in trade, huge deficit for you and a huge surplus for us. I don't think that this should continue. I don't think that this will continue. Because for us, such an imbalance is already a problem. rather than the benefits. So, and also, things are always changing. For instance, we are losing our edge in labor cost. Labor cost is rising very fast in China. So some of the labor-intensive manufacturers are moving out of China to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, or other countries. So gradually things will change. But we have to make more efforts to achieve kind of a balance for the trade relations between our two countries. That's why I think our two working teams are even talking to each other right now, try to find a solution. I'm quite confident that if we could have a balanced approach to each other's concerns, we'll be able to find a solution. Maybe we cannot solve all the problems right now, but we'll address the short-term problem and also look at the long-term, more structural problems. We'll be able to do that. Then for fair competition, of course everybody would like to have fair competition, so-called level playing field. But personally, I always believe whether we have a level playing field very much depends on where you stand. For instance, maybe many of our American friends, even in the business, believe that Chinese companies have got too much help from the government, so it's not fair for them. But from the perspective of Chinese companies, they might believe this competition between them and their American counterparts is not quite fair from the very beginning. Because you are big transnationals. You have the production distribution network globally. And you have all the expertise. You have a long history behind you. And also, maybe the most important thing is that you have the US dollar as the international reserve currency.
For now.
No, you have U.S. dollars.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you see, the problem is that you could print it. We have to produce something to earn it. So what you need is a good printer. And we have to make real good products. So I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I understand this is a perspective from many Chinese companies. As for the Made in China 2025, I think actually it's kind of an idea, it's kind of a goal. I think maybe all the major economies, maybe for some very small economies, they are not in a position to do that. I think for all the major economies, they may all have the goal or aspiration that someday I will take the lead in these high-tech manufacturing. We will become one of the strongest economies in the world. I think this is only natural and even legitimate for all the major economies to have such aspirations. So, but this is an open plan. It's open to Chinese companies, to American companies operating in China. It's open to everybody. It does not mean that we want to make all these good things by the year 2025 as the exclusion of U.S. companies. This is not possible, actually. You can never dominate all these high-tech sectors just by one country. I mean, you can never dominate. Maybe you could have some dominance for a while, but if we do have a fair competition, others will catch up. And that will make everybody more competitive. Besides, there's still restrictions or prohibitions on high-tech products sale to China. So you don't let us to buy things from you, and you don't let us to make them ourselves. So what is the way out?
So let me just press you on that for a moment. You're suggesting, and I think not incorrectly, that Made in China in 2025 or elements of that plan certainly are open. But what about, say, artificial intelligence, telecommunications, cloud computing? Are you suggesting that these would be open markets in China for foreign companies? Because it doesn't seem like they are right now.
I think in all these areas, we are still trying to catch up. So, inevitably, we have to be open because we want to learn from others. We cannot shut the door. Then we'll have no chance to learn from you.
And Ambassador, I'm going to give you a chance to respond with the following question. Let me try to tie this together a little bit because I can see a very clear string and theme through here. And so we'll stick with this discussion for a moment. I think what I'm hearing is that for the long time, and we're talking about the past 40 years of our relationship and the next 40, for most of that 40 years, the economic relationship between our two countries, I think we could say, and in fact, I believe President Xi, when he was vice president and visited the U.S., did say that the economic relationship, he called it the ballast and the propeller of the relationship. I call it a shock absorber of the relationship. In other words, the security tensions that we often have between our two countries, as you mentioned, that's been the source of most of the crises that we faced bilaterally. The differences in our governing systems. We've been able to kind of put those things on the shelf because the economic relationship was highly complementary. Well, that's now changing. China needs to go exactly the same place we do for its future growth and prosperity that the United States does. So that economic relationship now is becoming competitive, certainly, maybe in some spaces conflictual. And it seems to me that perhaps with that shift, it allows these other items, the security tensions, the governmental differences, to come out of the box a little more frequently and rapidly than they might otherwise. So in other words, Senator Sullivan this morning said that we're at a pivot point in our relationship. Is this the pivot point that the economic relationship is shifting a bit?
Well, you mean we cannot do it the other way around? We have the security issues as a stabilizer.
Get better. We can try it.
We can try it. But what is encouraging is that the mil-to-mil relations have improved a great deal.
Definitely so.
Over the last few years. This is very encouraging. You see, Secretary Cohen mentioned his attempt to set up a hotline. Now, the only video hotline between our two sides is between the two militaries, not between the Foreign Ministry and the State Department, the two militaries. I think this is encouraging. We should make more efforts in this direction. But I think, yes, the economic relation used to be a stabilizer, or propeller, or ballast, or whatever. Something very good for the overall relation. Now we have more problems. But I think if we look at the larger picture, now we are the two biggest economies in the world. There is a clear need for us to have better macroeconomic policy coordination. And I'm quite sure that what is good for the US economy would be good for Chinese economy, and also vice versa. So at the macro level, the need is clearly there. We cannot afford to have a big recession in the US, for instance. And I don't think that the US would like to see a downturn of the Chinese economy. But this is at the macro level. At the micro level, well, each company might have a different situation. And some of the issues Secretary Cohen just mentioned may just exist because you have to look at the whole process. Now, this year is the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. And this has been a learning process for us. When we first started, we had very little knowledge of how global economy was functioning and how to do business globally. And I think 40 years ago, very few people knew the concept of intellectual property rights. But over the past 4 decades, we have learned a great deal. And today, protection of intellectual property rights is China's own need. We are doing this not just to take care of the concerns of US companies, because we need it ourselves. That's why President Xi, in his speech at the Boao Forum last month, lists this as one of the 4 priority areas for China's next step of opening up, better protection of intellectual property rights. So I think as time goes by, as we move forward, this issue could be very well addressed because we have growing mutual need to have effective protection. Of course, there are always competition. I think even between U.S. companies themselves, a lot of things happen. And maybe some of our companies, while learning all the good examples, sometimes they also learn, incidentally, some bad examples. I don't know. But as far as China's law and policies are concerned, it's quite clear. And we have set up special courts for protection of intellectual property rights. So I'm quite optimistic going forward that we will do a much better job, and the concerns of the specific companies will be taken good care of. But as for the issue of transfer of technology in the broad global context, this has always been an issue between the so-called developed countries and developing countries. Because I spent many years dealing with the United Nations on the economic side. When we were talking about economic development in the UN, in this multilateral setting, when we were talking about environmental protection, most of the time, people from the developing countries, especially countries like maybe India, South Africa, will raise this issue of technology transfer. I still remember a few years ago there was a very heated debate, a kind of a dispute between some pharmaceutical companies in America and Europe with countries like India and South Africa about some of the special medicine. So I think we have to strike a balance. Of course, we need to protect intellectual property rights. Otherwise, people will lose the incentive to innovate. They should be sufficiently rewarded. But at the same time, if you have a new technology, if you have a new product, if it's not widely used in the market, you don't have any benefit. It's not something like an antique or the beautiful book you showed me yesterday. You just keep to yourself. You have to spread out. You have to enable more people to be aware of it, to use it. So I think there is always a balance we have to try to achieve. But still, I think for China now the pressing need is to enhancing our protection of intellectual property rights, more for our own benefits, in our own interest.
Thank you. Let me just stay with you on that point, and if you can respond briefly so I can let Secretary Cohen respond. You mentioned, and thank you for mentioning, that this is also the 40th anniversary of Reform and Opening.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of circles in the U.S., but actually all over the world, China scholars I speak to all over the world, increasingly there's an idea that China now has the reform part, but no more opening. That they have reform, internal reform for their own sort of purposes and so on, but the opening piece is missing. And I think it's fair to say that certainly over the last 5 years, we haven't seen any dramatic openings. In part, the now famous third plenum decision, seemed not to be fully implemented. But President Xi seemed to suggest that was about to change with his speech. And in fact, Liu He suggested that was going to change with his speech at Davos. So when will we see it? And what might we look for in this process? And let me also say that it strikes me that based on what Central Bank Governor Yi Gang said when he was here in Washington, in fact, there are many opening things he would like to do, but in part this challenge our two countries are facing right now on trade might block some of those efforts.
Yeah,
so maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah. I think you are right. Well, when China first started its opening up and reform, because we started from very, very low point. So, of course, it took a lot of courage and wisdom to do that. But still, it was relatively easy to see results. You see, you give the freedom to the farmers to grow whatever they like, sell whatever they like, and they got rich. People see the results immediately, and everybody could benefit from it. Now, for the next stage of reform and opening up in China, we are focusing on the more difficult parts, the toughest jobs that have been left. Maybe all the easy things have been done. What is left is the most difficult thing. So it will take more time, more efforts. It is certainly more challenging. So that's why maybe some people could say there's slow progress. But there's real progress. If we can really deal with these difficult issues, I think we'll have even more significant progress than before. And I think if you look at, you mentioned a few people's names. If you look at the economic team after the 19th Party Congress, you could say all of these people, they are reformers. They are well known here in the United States, and they know very well the United States. They know America, they know Americans, and they have been reformers over the last few decades. I think all of them were deeply involved in the reform and opening up of the last couple of decades. And Secretary Cohen just now gave a very high remarks about the achievement of China's development. This is because we had this policy of reform and opening up. So if you have a successful policy, there's no reason why you should change it. But of course, the way you implement it, the way you push it forward could be different because you are dealing with different issues. And also, honestly, some of the supporters or advocates in early stage of reform and opening up could now become resistance to further reform and opening up.
Interesting.
I'm not saying they are good or bad people, but you see, you do have some interest. Reform is basically, and opening up is basically redistribution of power and wealth and interest. Of course, if you move somebody's cheese, somebody will not be very happy. But I think further reform and opening up will serve the larger interests of the country. And there's no doubt that the leadership is determined to push it.
You mentioned obviously one of your big concerns is mutual trust and strategic mutual trust. China obviously has just celebrated the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, and it's pretty clear that Marx is being re-emphasized in China, and that his thinking is an important component of what President Xi at the 19th Party Congress dubbed socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Many in the West, I think it's fair to say, don't seem to understand why the Chinese Communist Party is doing this. And some even see it as retrograde or perhaps dangerous. And I think you've seen this in the narrative here in this town in the last few days. What should we take from this development in terms of how we should understand China's trajectory going forward and the role that Marxism plays in society? Is this something we should be fearful of?
Well, Chris, I think you raised a very important and relevant question. And also, Secretary Cohen made a lot of thought-provoking remarks just now. So let me try to respond on all of them, but I will try to be brief, of course.
No problem.
First of all, everybody else is watching what is happening in the United States. That's why I asked the question at Harvard. The America I used to know, open, confident, and optimistic America, is it still there? And I even told them, I know I cannot find the answer in Washington, D.C. That's why I come to Harvard. But I was not referring to this group. You know what I mean, yeah. But we are all watching very closely what is happening here. Not because we want to have something to do with it or try to interfere with it. But we are keenly aware what is happening here could have a very important spillover effect on everybody else. Because you are still the most powerful country in the world. And you will remain so, I think, at least during my lifetime. Well, I hope to live to 120 years. But you see, I think people talk a lot about this is a divided country now. Although there's a disagreement about what the divides really are and how to address them, but I think there's a widespread agreement that this country is divided and it's a problem. Maybe this is a good starting point for you to overcome these difficulties and to borrow President Trump's term and become great again. But you are always a great country. You don't have to be great again. You remain great. You see, if you look at the Chinese translation of the name of the United States, 美国, literally it means beautiful country. So I hope and I'm confident you'll continue to be a beautiful country for a long time to come. But I think for big countries like US and China, the real challenge is not any international challenge. And if we have some competition between us, the real competition or the main arena of competition is not the global stage, but our own governance at home. My good friend Richard Haass wrote a book a few years ago, Foreign Policy Begins at Home. I quite agree with him. So if we could have good governance at home, I don't think anybody else could really challenge us, challenge countries like US or China. And if we fail to do so, I don't think anybody else could really help us. So in terms of fair competition, let's try to see if we can run our own house, put our own house in order, if we could have a good governance at home. And we could certainly learn from each other. Although we never believe there should be a single model that could be copied everywhere in the world, but still we could learn a lot from each other. We could learn from each other's successes as well as failures. This is also a part of the so-called fair competition. And I remember some years ago, maybe in the first Clinton term, there was a big debate here in the United States, what to do with China. Engagement versus containment. Of course, fortunately, people came to the right conclusion. But this question comes back again and again. As you said, Senator Sullivan said this morning, maybe we are again at such a moment. We have to have a clear idea. We have to have a good answer. What should characterize our relationship? I believe engagement should still be the right choice. Of course, there is increasing competition, and I agree with Secretary Cohen that no one can really contain China. Maybe today, if we have the debate, is engagement versus confrontation, not containment. But confrontation is certainly not a good choice. I think maybe we can look at the example of sports. If you want to run faster, you don't look over your shoulder to see if somebody is catching up. You could feel somebody is catching up. This will force you to run even faster. I think that this is what real and fair competition is all about. We should all try to run faster ourselves, not always looking back to see if somebody is coming and try to raise some barriers to stop him. But what worries me right now, honestly, I see I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. Some people are trying to have a so-called glass curtain descending between our two countries. They are not only questioning our economic relation or political relation, they are even questioning the people-to-people exchanges, educational exchanges, cultural relations. They are even so suspicious of the Chinese students who are studying here. I think that this is very, very dangerous. This is very dangerous. We have to make sure that these things will not become the mainstream thinking in the United States. Then let me come back to your question about Marxism. First, China has been consistent that our guiding theory, our guiding thinking is Marxism. This has been the case all along. China never tried to hide it. We've been quite consistent, clear, and transparent. Number two, when we say Marxism, we are not saying that this is a kind of a dogma or just a pure theory. We believe this is a way of understanding the world. This is a guide to our thinking, and more importantly, a guide to our action. How we can bring better life to our people in today's world. Number three, we are fully aware Marxism originated in the developed world. It did not originate in China. So this is a kind of an import we have. Very important import.
High-tech import?
Yeah, high-tech, yeah. Software, high-tech, whatever. And hopefully people will put this into the calculation if they look at the trade balance. But we believe that we have to make it adapted to the Chinese realities. So we are not just memorizing or copying specific conclusions or views of Karl Marx maybe more than 100 years ago.
200.
Yeah, well, he was born 200 years ago.
That's true. Yeah.
Then the Manifesto of Communism was published 170 years ago. Yeah. We are not just try to copy all these specific conclusions of Karl Marx. We are trying to make them fit the Chinese realities. That's why we always have that phrase, with Chinese characteristics. This is not just a catchphrase. This is what we are aiming at, that any theory we learn from others, we should have it adapted to the Chinese realities. And we should innovate. In this area, in this realm, innovation is also important. As President Xi said at the Party Congress last year, there's no limit to practice, to human practice. There's no limit to human history. Neither should there be limit to innovation of theories. I think this is our approach to Marxism. And maybe not only China is studying Marxism so carefully. I think more recently, especially since the financial crisis 10 years ago, many people in the West are also have another look at Marxism. I think recently there are comments and articles here and there about some of the basic views of Karl Marx and their relevance to today's world. So I think it's worthwhile that people should have another look at what Marx said years ago.